Standing outside the Pentagon's most secure entrance, watching black SUVs roll past me like I was invisible, I never imagined that in 30 minutes I'd be walking through those same doors with the Secretary of Defense himself. But that morning, staring at my phone screen, all I could think about was how my own father had deliberately left my name off the guest list for the most important day of his career. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The notification had come at 6:47 a.m. Pentagon ceremony, guest list confirmed. I'd been expecting it for weeks. Dad had been promoted to Deputy Director of Defense Intelligence, and today was his official recognition ceremony. The kind of event that happens maybe once in a lifetime, where generals shake hands with politicians and careers are celebrated in rooms most people never see. I clicked the attachment with coffee still warming my hands, scrolling through names I recognized from childhood dinner conversations. Uncle Marcus, Dad's brother who'd never served a day but somehow always found his way into military events. Patricia Henley, Dad's assistant who'd worked with him for barely 8 months. Even Sandra Kellerman was there, his ex-girlfriend from 2 years ago, who he'd dated for exactly 6 weeks. My name wasn't anywhere. I read through it 3 times, thinking maybe there was a second page, maybe the list was incomplete. But there it was, complete with RSVP confirmations and security clearance numbers. 27 names. 27 people Dad thought deserved to witness this moment with him. I wasn't one of them. The apartment suddenly felt smaller. I'd moved to Washington, D.C. specifically to be closer to him after Mom died 4 years ago. Left my job in Portland, left friends, left a life I'd built for myself. Dad had encouraged it, said family was important, said we needed to stick together, but apparently together had conditions I wasn't aware of. My phone buzzed. A text from my stepmother, Helen. So excited for today. Can't wait to see you at the ceremony. Helen thought I was invited. Of course she did. What kind of father doesn't invite his own daughter to something like this? I stared at the message, fingers hovering over the keyboard. I could pretend I was sick, food poisoning, sudden work emergency. Anything to avoid the conversation that would inevitably lead to the truth. Dad didn't want me there. Instead, I called him. Cassie, honey, I'm in meetings all morning. Can this wait? His voice had that crisp military efficiency he'd perfected over 30 years of service. I got the guest list for today. Silence. Not the good kind where someone's thinking of what to say. The kind where someone's calculating how much truth they can get away with. About that, he finally said. It's a small venue, very limited space, you understand. Patricia Henley is on the list, your assistant. Patricia handles sensitive information. It's appropriate for her to be there. Sandra Kellerman is on the list. Another pause. Sandra has connections in the defense contracting community, networking opportunities. I felt something cold settle in my chest. What's my excuse, Dad? Why am I not networking worthy enough for your big day? Cassie, don't be dramatic. There will be other events. Will there? Because this feels pretty final to me. I have to go, we'll talk later. The line went dead. I sat there holding my phone, staring at Helen's text, feeling like I'd just been erased from my own family. It wasn't the first time Dad had made it clear that his career came before everything else, but it was the first time the message had been delivered with such precision. Helen texted again. Should I pick you up at 2? The ceremony starts at 3. This time I called her. Helen, I need to tell you something. I'm not actually invited to the ceremony. What do you mean? Of course you're invited. You're his daughter. Check the guest list. My name's not on it. I heard papers rustling, then Helen's sharp intake of breath. This has to be a mistake. Let me call the event coordinator. It's not a mistake. But your family, you're his only child. The words hung there between us. His only child. The person who'd sat through countless military functions growing up, who'd moved across the country to be near him, who'd taken care of Mom during her final months while he was deployed overseas for the 3rd time in 2 years. I just spoke to him, I said. It's not a mistake. Helen was quiet for a long moment. I'm going to fix this. Helen, don't. It's fine. It's not fine. This is wrong, and I'm going to fix it. She hung up before I could argue. I spent the next hour pacing my apartment, trying to decide if I was angrier at Dad for excluding me or at myself for caring so much. By the time Helen called back, I'd convinced myself that maybe this was for the best. Maybe it was time to stop pretending we had the kind of relationship where fathers invite daughters to important events. I spoke to the Pentagon events office, Helen said. The guest list is locked. Security protocols, background checks, all finalized weeks ago. They can't add anyone at this point. See, it's impossible anyway. But I also called your father. Had a very long conversation about family priorities and what kind of man leaves his daughter off the guest list for the most important day of his career. Quote, I could picture that conversation. Helen didn't argue often, but when she did, she was thorough. What did he say? He said he was trying to keep his professional and personal life separate, that having family there would be too emotional, too distracting. And what did you say? I told him that was the biggest load of bureaucratic bullshit I'd ever heard, and that if he thought his assistant was more important than his daughter at his own ceremony, he needed to reevaluate his priorities. Despite everything, I smiled. Helen had been in my life for only 2 years, but she'd figured out how to handle Dad better than I ever had. I don't think that's going to change anything, I said. Maybe not, but I'm not giving up. I have an idea, but I need you to trust me. What kind of idea? The kind that might get us both in trouble, but also might get you into that ceremony. I looked around my apartment, at the pictures of Dad and me from when I was younger, before his career became more important than everything else. At the framed copy of his Bronze Star citation that I'd made for his birthday. At the life I'd built around being close to someone who apparently didn't want me close at all. What do you need me to do? Get dressed like you're going to the most important military event of your life. Meet me at the Pentagon at 2:30. And Cassie? Yeah? Wear something that makes you look like you belong there, because one way or another, you're going to be at that ceremony. The Pentagon parking lot was a maze of military precision and bureaucratic chaos. Security checkpoints, metal detectors, and guards who looked like they could bench press a Humvee. I stood near the main visitor entrance in my navy blazer and dress pants, watching a steady stream of people in uniforms and suits disappear into the building's depths. Helen arrived exactly on time, stepping out of her silver Lexus like she owned the place. At 52, she had the kind of confidence that came from 20 years as a federal prosecutor before she'd met Dad. She walked straight to me, carrying a leather briefcase that looked official enough to contain state secrets. You look perfect, she said, eyeing my outfit. Professional, serious, like you have every right to be here. Which I don't. Yet. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a manila folder thick with documents. I've been making phone calls since we talked. Turns out your father isn't the only person with connections in this building. Helen, what did you do? I called in a favor. A very specific favor from someone who owes me a very specific debt. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. She handed me a temporary Pentagon visitor badge with my name already printed on it. Not a guest badge for the ceremony, a general building access pass. How did you get this? 3 years ago, I prosecuted a case involving military contractor fraud, saved the Pentagon about $40 million, and kept a very embarrassing scandal out of the newspapers. The Deputy Secretary of Defense never forgot that favor. I stared at the badge. This gets me into the building, but not into the ceremony. One step at a time. The ceremony is being held in the Secretary's conference room on the 4th floor. Very exclusive, very secure. But here's what I learned. They're expecting exactly 27 guests, and they've prepared exactly 27 chairs. So what happens if someone doesn't show up? What if, say, Sandra Kellerman suddenly can't make it? Helen, you didn't. She smiled in a way that reminded me why she'd never lost a case in court. Sandra received a very urgent phone call this morning about a family emergency. She'll be devastated to miss such an important event. That's illegal, isn't it? Making a phone call? Hardly. Being creative with information? That's just a good strategy. We walked toward the security checkpoint, Helen moving with the kind of purposeful stride that made guards step aside automatically. She'd done this before, navigated these halls, understood the unspoken rules of Washington power dynamics. "Even if we get inside," I said, "Dad's gonna see me and lose his mind." "Let him. This is his ceremony celebrating his achievements. If he wants to cause a scene in front of the Secretary of Defense and half the Pentagon brass, that's his choice." The security guard scanned my visitor badge, checked my ID, and waved us through without question. Helen's badge was a different color, the kind that meant she could go anywhere in the building without an escort. "There's something else," she said as we walked through corridors lined with portraits of generals and secretaries of defense going back decades. "I did some digging into why your father might have left you off the list. Beyond his general inability to prioritize family? Beyond that, turns out this promotion comes with something else. He's being considered for a position that requires an extremely high security clearance, higher than anything he's had before." We stopped at an elevator bank, Helen pressing the button for the 4th floor. "What does that have to do with me?" "Background investigations for that level of clearance go deep. They interview family members, examine relationships, look for any potential leverage points or security risks." The elevator doors opened, revealing a space that felt more like a secure vault than a normal lift. Helen swiped her badge again before pressing the button. "You think he left me off the list because of the security investigation?" "I think your father has always been better at managing his career than managing his relationships. If the investigators are looking at his family dynamics, having his daughter publicly present at his ceremony sends one message. Keeping her away sends another." The 4th floor was different from the rest of the building, quieter, more secure, with the kind of atmosphere that suggested important decisions were made here daily. We walked past offices with titles like Director of Strategic Planning and Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy. Which message does he want to send? That's what we're here to find out. Helen stopped outside a set of double doors marked Secretary's Conference Room. Through the glass panels, I could see people milling around inside, military uniforms mixing with business suits. Dad was near the front of the room, talking to a woman in Air Force blues with enough stars on her shoulders to fund a small war. "Last chance to change your mind," Helen said. I watched my father through the glass, animated and confident in a way I rarely saw at family dinners. This was his world, where he belonged, where people respected his opinions and valued his expertise. For 30 years he'd built this life, these relationships, this reputation. He really doesn't want me here. No, he doesn't. The question is whether you're going to let that stop you. A man in a dark suit approached from down the hallway, walking with the kind of measured pace that suggested he was important enough that people waited for him, not the other way around. Helen straightened, recognizing him before I did. "Secretary Morrison," she said. The Secretary of Defense stopped, a slight smile crossing his face. "Helen Rodriguez, I should have known you'd be involved in today's festivities. I'm here as family, actually. This is Cassie Montgomery, Colonel Montgomery's daughter." Secretary Morrison looked at me with curiosity, then back at Helen. I wasn't aware Colonel Montgomery had family attending today. Quote, "There was some confusion with the guest list," Helen said smoothly, "but we've sorted it out." The secretary studied my face for a moment, and I had the distinct impression he was cataloging details, filing away information for future reference. "Well, any friend of Helen's is welcome here. She saved this department considerable embarrassment a few years back." "I'm honored to be here, sir," I managed. "Your father is receiving a well-deserved recognition today. His work in intelligence analysis has been exceptional. He's always been dedicated to his career." Something in my tone must have caught his attention because he paused, looking between Helen and me with the expression of someone who'd spent decades reading between the lines of diplomatic conversations. "Career dedication is admirable," he said carefully, "but the best officers understand that strength comes from more than just professional achievement." Helen nodded. "That's exactly what we've been discussing." "I see." The secretary checked his watch. "The ceremony begins in 15 minutes. I trust you'll both find it enlightening." He continued down the hall, leaving Helen and me standing outside the conference room doors. "He knows something's up," I said. "Of course he does. You don't get to be Secretary of Defense without being able to read a room or a hallway conversation. What happens when we walk in there and Dad sees me? We find out what kind of man your father really is. Whether he's the type who puts family first or the type who values appearances over relationships. Helen reached for the door handle, then paused. Cassie, whatever happens in there, remember this. You have every right to be proud of your father's achievements, and he should be proud to have you witness them. She opened the door, and we stepped into a room that would either repair my relationship with my father or destroy it completely. The conference room fell silent the moment we stepped inside. Not the gradual quiet that comes when people notice something unusual, but the immediate, complete silence that happens when everyone in a room simultaneously realizes something unexpected is occurring. Dad's back was to the door, but I watched his shoulders tense as conversations around him stopped mid-sentence. The woman in Air Force blues he'd been talking to looked past him toward the entrance, her expression shifting from polite interest to sharp attention. "Colonel Montgomery," she said quietly, "I believe you have visitors." Dad turned around slowly, like someone who already knew what they were going to see but hoped they were wrong. When his eyes met mine, I saw something I'd never seen in his face before. Genuine fear. Not anger, not disappointment, fear. "Cassie?" His voice was barely audible. "What are you doing here?" The room was watching us now, 26 people in dress uniforms and business suits, witnessing what was clearly becoming a family drama in one of the most secure conference rooms in America. Helen stepped slightly forward, positioning herself between Dad and me like a diplomatic buffer. "She's here because she belongs here," Helen said. "Today is about family as much as career achievement." Dad's face cycled through emotions too quickly to track. Confusion, anger, calculation, then something that might have been panic. "This isn't appropriate." The guest list was carefully planned. "Carefully planned to exclude your daughter," Helen replied. A murmur ran through the room. I caught fragments of whispered conversations. "His daughter?" And not on the list. And family issues. The kind of gossip that would spread through Pentagon corridors within hours. The Air Force general stepped forward, her expression unreadable. "Perhaps we should begin the ceremony. I'm sure personal matters can be resolved afterward." "Actually," came a voice from the back of the room, "I think this is exactly the kind of personal matter that should be addressed before we begin." Secretary Morrison had entered through a side door, carrying a folder and wearing the expression of someone who'd been listening to the conversation from the hallway. He walked to the front of the room with deliberate steps, the kind that suggested he was about to take control of a situation that had spiraled beyond anyone's expectations. "Colonel Montgomery," he said, "would you care to explain to the room why your daughter wasn't included in today's guest list?" Dad's face went pale. "Sir, with respect, this is a family matter." "Is it?" "Because I'm looking at a room full of people who are here to celebrate your professional achievements, and your family is standing by the door looking like uninvited guests. That doesn't strike me as a family matter, that strikes me as a leadership issue." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Dad straightened into his most formal military posture, but I could see sweat beading on his forehead. "Sir, I felt it was important to maintain professional boundaries. The guest list reflected professional relationships and strategic networking opportunities." "Strategic networking opportunities," Secretary Morrison repeated the words like he was tasting something unpleasant. "Ms. Rodriguez, would you mind sharing your perspective on this situation?" Helen stepped forward with the confidence of someone who'd spent decades in courtrooms. "Secretary Morrison, I've known Colonel Montgomery for 2 years. In that time, I've watched him navigate complex professional challenges with exceptional skill. But I've also watched him treat his family relationships like potential security risks rather than sources of strength." Elaborate. "His daughter moved across the country to be closer to him after her mother's death. She's attended military functions, supported his career, and made significant personal sacrifices to maintain their relationship. Yet when it came time to celebrate his most significant professional achievement, he deliberately excluded her." Secretary Morrison opened his folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "I have the guest list here. Let me see. Patricia Henley, assistant. Sandra Kellerman, former romantic interest. Marcus Montgomery, brother with no military service. But no Cassie Montgomery, daughter and only child. Each name hit like a physical blow. Dad's face was getting redder with every word. Sir, Dad said, I can explain the rationale behind each invitation. Please do. Start with Ms. Kellerman. Sandra has connections in the defense contracting community. Her presence represents potential future collaboration opportunities. And your daughter? What opportunities does she represent? Dad opened his mouth, then closed it. The room waited. I could hear the ventilation system, someone shifting in their chair, the distant sound of traffic outside. She represents, Dad said finally, a potential complication for the security clearance review. The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Secretary Morrison set down his folder and looked at Dad with the kind of expression usually reserved for officers who'd made catastrophic tactical errors. Explain. The position I'm being considered for requires extensive background investigation. Family relationships are scrutinized for potential leverage points or security vulnerabilities. I thought it would be prudent to maintain professional distance. Quote, You thought it would be prudent, Secretary Morrison said slowly, to treat your own daughter as a security risk. Not a risk, sir, a complication. Colonel Montgomery, in 30 years of military service, what would you say is the most important leadership quality? Dad looked confused by the change in direction. Integrity, sir? Integrity. The quality of being honest and having strong moral principles. Would you say that deliberately excluding your family from important events demonstrates integrity? Sir, I was trying to protect both my career and her. Protect her from what? From being proud of her father's achievements? From witnessing a moment that represents 3 decades of dedicated service? The room was completely silent now. Even the ventilation system seemed to have stopped. I felt like I was watching my father's career disintegrate in real time, and I wasn't sure if I should feel vindicated or horrified. Colonel, Secretary Morrison continued, the position you're being considered for requires making difficult decisions under pressure. It requires balancing competing priorities and understanding that leadership means taking care of the people who depend on you. How can we trust you to lead others if you can't even maintain a relationship with your own family? Dad's hands were shaking slightly. Sir, I've always put the mission first. Have you? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've put your personal ambition first. There's a difference. Secretary Morrison walked over to where I was standing with Helen. Up close, he was less intimidating and more grandfatherly, with kind eyes that suggested he'd had this type of conversation before. Ms. Montgomery, he said, I apologize that your first experience in this building involved witnessing your father prioritize politics over family. That's not representative of the values we try to uphold here. Thank you, sir. However, I'd like to ask you a question. Despite everything that's happened today, are you proud of your father's service? I looked across the room at Dad, still standing at attention, still trying to maintain his military bearing even as his world collapsed around him. 30 years of service, deployments, missed birthdays, late nights, and dedication to something bigger than himself. Whatever his failures as a father, his commitment to his country had been absolute. Yes, sir, I am. Good. Because exceptional service deserves recognition, even when it comes from flawed people. He turned back to Dad. Quote, Colonel Montgomery, the ceremony will proceed as planned, but there's been a change to the guest list. Your daughter will be seated in the front row, where the family belongs. Dad's shoulders sagged slightly. Sir, the security protocols have been waived by my direct order. Ms. Montgomery has been cleared for this event. The secretary looked around the room at the assembled guests, military and civilian alike, all witnessing a lesson in leadership that none of them had expected. Ladies and gentlemen, we're here to honor 3 decades of distinguished service. But service without family, without personal connections, without the people who matter most, is just a job. Today we celebrate not just Colonel Montgomery's professional achievements, but the people who made those achievements meaningful. He gestured toward an empty chair in the front row. Ms. Montgomery, would you take your seat? We have a ceremony to begin. Sitting in the front row, the secretary's conference room felt surreal. 20 minutes earlier, I'd been standing outside the Pentagon feeling like an unwanted outsider. Now I was watching my father receive the Defense Intelligence Service Medal, while the most powerful people in the Defense Department applauded his achievements. The ceremony itself was everything Dad had probably imagined it would be. Formal speeches about his analytical work in counterterrorism, his role in identifying emerging threats, his leadership in modernizing intelligence operations. Secretary Morrison presented the medal with words that painted a picture of an exemplary officer who dedicated his life to protecting American interests. But something had changed in the room's atmosphere. The earlier confrontation had shifted the dynamic, and I could feel people watching not just the ceremony, but the family drama that had preceded it. Dad stood at attention during the presentation, but his usual confidence was missing. He looked like someone going through the motions of receiving an honor he was no longer sure he deserved. When the formal presentations ended, the room broke into smaller groups for reception-style conversations. I remained seated, unsure of my role in this social maze of military hierarchy and political networking. Helen had positioned herself near the refreshment table, engaging in animated conversation with a Navy admiral about prosecution strategies for military contractors. "Miss Montgomery?" I turned to find a woman in an Army dress uniform approaching my chair. The nameplate read, Colonel Sarah Chen, and she had the kind of bearing that suggested she'd earned her rank through competence rather than politics. "Yes, ma'am?" I wanted to introduce myself. "I work with your father in the Intelligence Analysis Division." She sat down in the chair next to mine, her voice dropping to a more conversational tone. "That was quite an entrance you made today." "Not exactly what I planned." "I imagine not. But I'm glad you're here. Your father talks about you more than you might think." I looked across the room where Dad was standing with a group of other colonels, his body language still rigid with embarrassment. He has a funny way of showing it. Military culture can be complicated when it comes to family relationships. We're trained to compartmentalize, to separate personal and professional lives. Sometimes we get so good at it that we forget how to integrate them. Is that supposed to excuse what happened today? Colonel Chen was quiet for a moment, watching Dad's interaction with his colleagues. "No, it's not an excuse, but it might be an explanation. Your father has spent 30 years in a world where showing personal vulnerability can be seen as a professional weakness. Today he was forced to confront the cost of that mindset." "The cost?" "Missing out on sharing his most important achievement with the person who should matter most." I studied her face, trying to understand why she was telling me this. "You think I should forgive him?" "I think forgiveness is a personal choice that only you can make. But I also think your father learned something today that no amount of military training could have taught him." Across the room, I noticed Dad excusing himself from his conversation group and walking toward the windows that overlooked the Pentagon courtyard. He stood alone, his medal still pinned to his uniform, staring out at the afternoon traffic. "He looks miserable," I said. "He should. Great leaders understand that their achievements mean nothing if they don't have people to share them with." Colonel Chen stood up, straightening her uniform. "For what it's worth, the work your father does saves lives. Not in the dramatic, movie-style way, but in the quiet, analytical way that prevents attacks before they happen. He's genuinely good at his job. But terrible at being a father. Today, yes. But people can change, even stubborn military officers. The question is whether they're given the opportunity." She walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts and a clear view of my father standing by himself, looking more isolated than I'd ever seen him. Helen appeared at my elbow. "How are you holding up?" "I'm not sure. This whole thing feels like a fever dream." "Well, the fever dream isn't over yet. Secretary Morrison wants to speak with you before you leave." "About what?" "He didn't say, but based on his conversation with your father, I suspect it's not going to be a casual chat about the weather." Secretary Morrison approached before I could ask more questions. Up close, he looked tired in the way that suggested he'd been dealing with difficult personnel issues all day. "Miss Montgomery, would you mind joining me for a brief conversation? There's something I'd like to discuss with you." We walked to a quieter corner of the room, away from the reception conversations and military small talk. Secretary Morrison gestured to a pair of chairs positioned near a window overlooking the Pentagon's inner courtyard. "I owe you an apology," he said once we were seated. "What happened today should never have occurred. Your father's decision to exclude you from this ceremony reflects poorly on his judgment and our institution's values." "Sir, you don't need to apologize for my father's choices." Actually, I do. Military leadership isn't just about tactical decisions and strategic planning. It's about understanding that the people we serve with, and the families who support them, are what make the mission meaningful. He paused, looking out the window at the courtyard below. I've been in this job for 3 years. I've attended dozens of ceremonies, presented hundreds of medals, and met with thousands of military families. The ones I remember aren't the officers with perfect records. They're the ones who understand that service is about more than personal achievement. Are you telling me this changed your opinion of my father? I'm telling you that your father has some thinking to do about what kind of leader he wants to be. The position he was being considered for requires someone who can balance competing priorities and maintain strong relationships under pressure. Today demonstrated that he struggles with both. The implication was clear. Dad's promotion prospects had just taken a serious hit. Will this affect his career? His career will be determined by how he responds to what happened today, whether he learns from it or repeats the same patterns. Secretary Morrison pulled a business card from his jacket pocket. I'm giving you my direct contact information, not because I expect you to use it, but because I want you to know that this institution values family relationships, even when individual officers don't. I took the card, feeling its weight like a responsibility I hadn't asked for. There's something else, he continued. Your father's work in intelligence analysis has been exceptional. He's identified threats that have saved countless lives, prevented attacks that would have devastated communities. Whatever his failures as a father, his service to this country has been distinguished. Why are you telling me this? Because I suspect you're going to have a conversation with him soon, and I want you to understand the full picture. He's a flawed man who's done important work. Those two things can both be true. We sat in silence for a moment, watching people move through the courtyard below. Military personnel, civilian employees, contractors, all part of an enormous machine dedicated to national defense. What happens now? I asked. Now you decide whether you want to have a relationship with your father or not, and he decides whether he's willing to change enough to deserve one. Secretary Morrison stood up, straightening his suit jacket. Ms. Montgomery, thank you for attending today's ceremony. Your presence made it more meaningful than your father probably realized. He walked back toward the reception, leaving me alone with a business card and more questions than answers. Across the room, Dad was still standing by the windows, still alone, still looking like someone who'd just realized the cost of his choices. Helen appeared beside me again. Ready to go? I looked at my father one more time, weighing 30 years of complicated history against the possibility of something different. Actually, I said, I think there's one more conversation I need to have before we leave. Walking across the conference room toward my father felt like crossing a minefield. Every step brought me closer to a conversation I'd been avoiding for years, the kind that would either rebuild our relationship or destroy what little remained of it. Dad was still standing by the windows, but he'd seen me approaching in the reflection. His shoulders tensed, and I watched him take a deep breath before turning around. Up close, he looked older than I remembered, tired in a way that went beyond the stress of today's events. Cassie. His voice was different now, stripped of its usual military authority. I suppose we need to talk. I suppose we do. The reception was winding down around us, but we might as well have been alone. Dad gestured toward a small alcove near the windows, where we could speak without being overheard by the remaining guests. I owe you an explanation, he said once we were seated. Do you? Because explanations usually come before the damage, not after. He flinched, and I realized this was the first time I'd ever spoken to him without the careful politeness I'd maintained since childhood. The first time I'd allowed my actual feelings to show through. You're right to be angry. Am I? Because for the past few hours, I've been told by everyone except you that I have a right to be here, a right to be proud of you, a right to be part of your life. But I'm still waiting to hear that from the person who actually matters. Dad stared out the window at the Pentagon courtyard, where people were moving between buildings like pieces on an enormous chessboard. When your mother died, I promised myself I'd do better, be more present, more involved in your life. And yet here we are. Here we are. He turned back to face me, and for the first time, I saw something vulnerable in his expression. Cassie, I've been in the military for 30 years. I've learned to assess threats, identify risks, plan for contingencies. When the background investigation for this new position started, all I could think about were the questions they'd ask about our relationship. What about our relationship? The fights we had after your mother's funeral, the arguments about my deployment schedule, the fact that you moved across the country partly to get away from me, then moved back out of guilt. The words hit like physical blows because they were true. Our relationship had been complicated long before today's ceremony. So you decided the solution was to pretend I didn't exist? Quote, I decided the solution was to keep my professional and personal lives separate until after the promotion was finalized. And then what? You'd magically become a better father once you had the job you wanted? Dad was quiet for a long moment, the kind of silence that suggested he was finally confronting questions he'd been avoiding. I don't know, he said finally. I honestly don't know. The honesty was unexpected, more devastating than any excuse or justification would have been. I'd been prepared for him to defend his choices, to rationalize his behavior. I wasn't prepared for him to admit he didn't have a plan. Dad, do you remember the last time we had a real conversation? Not logistics about visits or updates about work, but an actual conversation. He started to answer, then stopped, his face going through calculations I recognized from childhood. He was trying to remember, and coming up empty. It was 3 months after Mom's funeral, I said. We were sitting in her garden, and you told me about the first time you met her. How she was arguing with a professor about Vietnam War policy, and you were so impressed by her passion that you asked her out even though you disagreed with everything she was saying. I remember that conversation. Do you remember what else you said? He shook his head. You said that loving someone meant being proud of who they were, even when it was inconvenient or complicated. Especially then. Dad's hands were clasped tightly in his lap, his knuckles white with tension. Your mother would be furious with me right now. Yeah, she would be. She'd also be disappointed that it took the Secretary of Defense publicly humiliating you to make you realize what you'd done. Secretary Morrison was right about everything he said, about leadership, about priorities, about what kind of man I've become. What kind of man have you become? The kind who treats his own daughter like a security risk. The kind who prioritizes career advancement over family relationships. The kind who forgets that the people we're trying to protect include the ones sitting right in front of us. He looked directly at me for the first time since we'd started talking, and I saw tears in his eyes that he was trying not to let fall. Cassie, I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to be the father you deserve, and I don't know if it's too late to learn. It's not too late, I said, surprised by my own words. But it's going to require you to actually try instead of just planning to try someday when it's more convenient. What does that look like? It looks like admitting that you've prioritized your career over our relationship for years, not just today. It looks like understanding that moving to Washington to be near you wasn't about guilt. It was about hope that we could have something better. Dad wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, a gesture so uncharacteristic it reminded me that beneath the uniform in the military bearing, he was just a person who'd made mistakes. The position Secretary Morrison was considering me for, he said, I probably lost it today. Probably. I thought that would devastate me. But sitting here, looking at what I almost lost permanently, losing a job doesn't seem like the worst thing that could happen. Dad, your career isn't the problem. The problem is that you've used your career as an excuse to avoid dealing with anything that requires emotional vulnerability. Like having a relationship with my daughter. Like having a relationship with anyone. When was the last time you had dinner with friends? When was the last time you did something just because you enjoyed it, not because it advanced your professional goals? He was quiet again, and I realized he was probably trying to remember the last time he'd prioritized anything besides work. Helen thinks you're capable of change, I said. She thinks you're worth the effort. What do you think? I looked at my father, this man who'd spent 30 years serving his country, who'd dedicated his life to analyzing threats and protecting people he'd never meet, who'd also failed spectacularly at protecting the relationship with the one person who should have mattered most. I think you're going to have to prove it. Not with grand gestures or promises about the future, but with consistent choices that prioritize our relationship over your convenience. And if I can't? If I mess this up again? Then you'll have to live with the consequences. But Dad, this is your chance. Right now, today, you get to decide what kind of person you want to be going forward. Secretary Morrison appeared in my peripheral vision, approaching Helen and several other officials. The reception was officially ending, and people were beginning to file out of the conference room. Colonel Montgomery, the secretary said when he reached us. I trust you and your daughter have had a productive conversation. Dad stood up, returning to military posture automatically. Yes, sir. Very productive. Good. Because I want to be clear about something. Today's events have given me serious concerns about your judgment and leadership capabilities. However, exceptional service deserves recognition, and your record speaks for itself. He paused, looking between Dad and me with the expression of someone delivering a carefully considered verdict. The position we discussed will be filled by someone else, but there will be other opportunities, assuming you demonstrate the kind of growth that today's events suggest you need. Understood, sir. I hope so, Colonel, because the best leaders understand that their greatest achievements mean nothing if they don't have the people they love to share them with. Secretary Morrison shook Dad's hand, then mine, before walking away with his entourage. Helen lingered, watching our exchange with the careful attention of someone who'd invested considerable effort in engineering this outcome. So, she said, how are we feeling about family dynamics at the moment? Dad looked at me, then back at Helen. Like we have a lot of work to do, but maybe, for the first time in years, we're willing to do it. I stood up, straightening my blazer and gathering my composure. Dad, Helen and I are driving back together, but I think maybe we should have dinner this weekend. Just the three of us. No work talk, no military functions. Just family. I'd like that very much. As we walked toward the conference room doors, I realized that the person entering this building 3 hours ago had been fundamentally different from the person leaving it. Not because everything was fixed, it wasn't, but because for the first time in years, I believed things could be different. The Pentagon hallways that had seemed so intimidating on the way in now felt like corridors I could navigate. The security checkpoints, the guards, the atmosphere of military precision, none of it seemed designed to keep me out anymore. Walking past the portraits of former secretaries of defense, I understood something I hadn't grasped earlier. This building wasn't just about power and policy and strategic planning. It was about people making difficult decisions under pressure, trying to balance competing priorities, attempting to protect the things that mattered most. Sometimes they succeeded, sometimes they failed spectacularly. But the possibility of getting it right, of choosing family over convenience, of prioritizing love over advancement, that possibility existed for everyone, even stubborn military officers who'd spent decades getting it wrong. Outside, the afternoon sun was setting over Washington, D.C., casting long shadows across the Pentagon parking lot. Helen's car was waiting where we'd left it, ordinary and civilian in a sea of government vehicles. Ready to go home? Helen asked. I looked back at the building where my father worked, where he'd received recognition for 30 years of service, where he'd learned the hardest lesson of his career. Yeah, I said, I'm ready to go home. 3 weeks after the Pentagon ceremony, I was sitting in Café Luna on Connecticut Avenue, watching Dad struggle with the menu like it contained classified information. He'd suggested meeting for lunch, neutral territory he'd called it, as if we were negotiating a peace treaty rather than attempting a normal father-daughter meal. The salmon looks good, he said, closing the menu with the decisive snap of someone making a tactical decision. You always order salmon when you're nervous. He looked up, surprised. I do? Every family dinner since I was 12. Salmon, no vegetables, extra bread. Mom used to say you treated restaurant menus like mission briefings. A smile flickered across his face, the first genuine one I'd seen from him since the ceremony. She wasn't wrong. I approach most things like mission briefings. Including family relationships? Especially family relationships. The server appeared, a college-aged girl with purple streaks in her hair, who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. Dad ordered his predictable salmon while I chose the pasta special, both of us navigating the strange territory of civilian small talk. Helen says you've been seeing a therapist, I said once we were alone again. Dr. Patricia Vance. She specializes in military personnel transitioning to different life phases. He paused, fidgeting with his water glass. She says I have what she calls emotional compartmentalization syndrome. Is that a real thing? Apparently, it's what happens when you spend 30 years training yourself not to feel things during crisis situations, then forget how to turn those feelings back on when the crisis is over. And she thinks she can fix that? She thinks I can learn to fix it, assuming I'm willing to do the work. He looked directly at me, something that had become easier for him in recent weeks. The question is whether you're willing to let me try. Our food arrived before I could answer, giving me time to consider the weight of what he was asking. The past 3 weeks had included 2 dinners at Helen's house, 1 awkward phone conversation about my job, and a series of text messages that felt like someone learning a new language. Dad, can I ask you something? Of course. During all those years when you were deployed, when you missed birthdays and holidays and school events, did you ever think about what it was like for me and Mom? He set down his fork, the question clearly requiring more consideration than he'd expected. Honestly? No. I thought about the mission, about the soldiers depending on me, about the strategic importance of what we were doing. I told myself that my family understood the sacrifice was necessary. But you never asked us if we understood. I never asked because I was afraid of what you might say. The admission hung between us like a challenge. This was the kind of conversation we'd never had before, the kind that required him to acknowledge feelings he'd spent decades avoiding. What did you think we might say? That we needed me more than the mission did, that choosing duty over family wasn't heroic, it was selfish. Would that have changed anything? I don't know, but it would have forced me to confront the fact that I was using military service as an excuse to avoid dealing with anything emotionally complicated. A businessman at the next table was talking loudly into his phone about quarterly projections, his voice cutting through our conversation like static. Dad glanced over with the kind of irritation that suggested he was struggling to maintain focus on personal rather than external distractions. Dr. Vance has you working on staying present, doesn't she? How did you know? Because you just noticed that guy on the phone instead of tuning him out completely. 3 weeks ago, you wouldn't have heard anything except your own thoughts. She calls it environmental awareness for emotional engagement. Basically learning to be aware of what's happening around me instead of disappearing into my head. Is it working? He considered the question while watching people move past the restaurant's large windows. Couples holding hands, parents pushing strollers, teenagers absorbed in their phones. Yesterday I was in a meeting about budget allocations, and instead of focusing on the spreadsheets, I found myself wondering what you were doing. Whether you were happy at work, whether you'd talked to any of your friends from Portland recently, whether you still played piano. I don't play piano anymore. I know, you stopped after your mother died, but I never asked why. Because it reminded me of her. She's the one who taught me, and after she was gone, sitting at the piano just made me feel empty. Do you miss it? Sometimes, but I'm not ready to start again. When you are ready, I'd like to hear you play. The simplicity of the statement caught me off guard. No pressure, no timeline, no strategic planning. Just a father expressing interest in something that mattered to his daughter. Dad, can I tell you something that might be hard to hear? I think I need to hear hard things right now. When I moved to Washington, I wasn't just hoping we'd have a better relationship. I was hoping you'd finally see me as a person instead of a responsibility you needed to manage. His face went through several expressions before settling on something that looked like understanding mixed with regret. How long have you felt like a responsibility instead of a daughter? Since I was about 14, maybe 15. Around the time I realized that conversations with you always ended with advice about college preparation or career planning, never with questions about what I was actually thinking or feeling. I thought I was being a good father, preparing you for the future, helping you make smart decisions. You were a good commanding officer, but commanding officers and fathers require different skill sets. The businessman at the next table finished his call and left, taking his distraction with him. The restaurant felt quieter now, more intimate, like a space where difficult conversations could happen without interference. Dr. Vance says the hardest part of therapy isn't learning new behaviors, Dad said. It's forgiving yourself for the damage the old behaviors caused. Have you forgiven yourself? I'm working on it, but more importantly, I'm working on earning forgiveness from the people I hurt. Dad, you didn't hurt me maliciously. You hurt me because you didn't know how to do anything else. Does that make it better or worse? It makes it understandable. Whether it makes it forgivable depends on what you do going forward. Quote. He nodded slowly, like someone processing information that would require significant policy changes. What would forgiveness look like, practically speaking? It would look like you calling me once a week, not because you have information to share, but because you want to know how I'm doing. It would look like you are asking about my life without immediately offering solutions. It would look like you remembering that I'm a person with feelings, not a problem that needs to be solved. And if I mess up, if I revert to old patterns, then we'll deal with it when it happens. But Dad, I need you to understand something. This isn't a one-time test you can pass or fail. This is an ongoing choice you'll have to make every time we interact. The server returned to refill our water glasses and ask about dessert. We both declined, but neither of us made any move to leave. The conversation felt unfinished, like we were in the middle of negotiating terms for a relationship neither of us fully understood yet. Cassie, there's something else I need to tell you about the position I lost. What about it? Secretary Morrison offered me a different assignment. Less prestigious, but more flexible, more time for personal relationships, fewer travel requirements. Are you going to take it? I already did. Because for the first time in 30 years, I'm more interested in being present for my life than I am in advancing my career. Outside, Washington traffic moved in its familiar patterns of controlled chaos. Inside, my father and I sat across from each other, two people trying to figure out how to build something new from the pieces of something that had never quite worked in the first place. Dad? Yeah? This is the best conversation we've had in years. Yeah, he said, smiling in a way that reached his eyes. It really is. 6 months later, I found myself back at the Pentagon, but this time the circumstances couldn't have been more different. Dad's new assignment included organizing a military families appreciation event, and he'd asked me to help with the planning. Not as his daughter reluctantly, but as someone whose perspective he genuinely valued. The catering contract needs final approval, I said, sliding the paperwork across his desk. His new office was smaller than his previous one, with windows facing the courtyard instead of the Potomac. But family photos now occupied prominent positions among his military commendations. Done. He signed without the meticulous review process I remembered from childhood, when every decision required strategic analysis. What's next? We need to confirm the guest speakers. Colonel Martinez confirmed for the morning session, and Dr. Williams will handle the afternoon workshop on military family communication. Perfect. And the child care arrangements? All set. Helen coordinated with the base family services to provide activities for kids during the adult sessions. Dad leaned back in his chair, a gesture of relaxation I'd rarely seen before his therapy work began. I have to admit, planning events with actual families in mind is more complicated than I expected. But more rewarding? Much more rewarding. Yesterday, a sergeant told me his 8-year-old daughter was excited about the family picnic portion. I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd planned something specifically to make a child happy. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. The man who'd spent years treating family relationships like security risks was now designing programs to strengthen military families. Speaking of children being happy, I said, Helen mentioned you're thinking about grandchildren. She mentioned we're thinking about grandchildren. As in, she's hoping you'll eventually provide some, and I'm learning to think about the future in terms of relationships, instead of just career milestones. And how's that working out for you? Terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. Dr. Vance says learning to want things that require emotional vulnerability is a sign of psychological growth. A knock on the door interrupted our conversation. Secretary Morrison entered, carrying a folder and wearing the kind of expression that suggested official business. Colonel Montgomery, Ms. Montgomery. I hope I'm not interrupting important family planning. Not at all, sir, Dad said, standing automatically. Cassie's been invaluable in organizing the family's event. So I've heard. The feedback from the initial planning sessions has been exceptional. Secretary Morrison turned to me with genuine interest. Your suggestions about including military children in the program design apparently revolutionized the entire approach. I just suggested asking the families what they actually wanted instead of assuming we knew. Revolutionary indeed. Colonel, your daughter has a talent for cutting through bureaucratic complexity to focus on what matters most. Quote. Dad looked at me with something I'd never seen before. Professional respect mixed with parental pride. She always has. I just wasn't paying enough attention to notice. Well, you're both paying attention now, which brings me to why I'm here. Secretary Morrison opened his folder and pulled out an official-looking document. The Department of Defense is launching a new initiative focused on military family support and retention. We need someone to head the program, someone who understands both military culture and family dynamics. He handed the folder to Dad, who opened it with curiosity rather than the desperate ambition that had characterized his previous career moves. This position would involve significant travel, policy development, and coordination with military installations worldwide, Secretary Morrison continued. It's also a promotion, with considerable responsibility and visibility. Dad read through the documents carefully, then looked up with an expression I didn't immediately recognize. Sir, this is an incredible opportunity, but I need to ask about the work-life balance expectations. 6 months ago, that question would never have occurred to him. Secretary Morrison smiled like someone who'd been hoping to hear exactly that response. The position specifically requires someone who prioritizes family relationships, since that's fundamental to the program's mission. Work-life balance isn't just encouraged, it's mandatory. In that case, Dad said, I'm honored to be considered. Excellent. There's one more thing. The position includes funding for a deputy director, someone to handle program coordination and family outreach. We'd like that person to have direct experience with military family challenges. He looked at me with an expression that suggested this conversation had been planned more carefully than I'd realized. Ms. Montgomery, would you be interested in developing your Pentagon planning skills into a full-time career? The offer hit me like a surprise deployment. Working with Dad, building programs that could help military families avoid the mistakes we'd made, creating something meaningful together. Yes, I would be very interested. Outstanding. You'll both start next month. After Secretary Morrison left, Dad and I sat in his office processing what had just happened. A professional partnership. A chance to work together on something that mattered. An opportunity to turn our personal growth into public service. Are you sure about this? I asked. Working together every day could either fix our relationship completely or destroy it permanently. 6 months ago, I would have been terrified of that risk. Now I think it's worth taking. Why? Because I've learned that the relationships worth having are the ones worth fighting for, and I've spent too many years not fighting for ours. Outside his office windows, the Pentagon courtyard was full of people coming and going, military personnel and civilians, all part of the enormous machine of national defense. But for the first time, I understood that the machine worked best when the people operating it had strong personal connections, solid family relationships, reasons beyond duty to care about their work. Dad? Yeah? I'm proud of you. Not just for your military service, but for being willing to change, to grow, to become the kind of person who puts family first. I'm proud of you too, for giving me the chance to prove I could be better, even when I didn't deserve it. We sat there for a moment, father and daughter, colleagues and partners, two people who'd figured out how to build something new from the broken pieces of something old. So, I said finally, ready to revolutionize military family support? With you? Absolutely. And for the first time in 30 years, my father and I were truly on the same team. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.